Spisbah, the director of the Australia-India Institute in Delhi, and we're here for another session of Bilateral Bites. Today we're welcoming Rebecca Prince-Ruiz, who is the founder of Plastic Free July. We're delighted to have Rebecca here today to talk more about environmental challenges, but more importantly, the positivity and the inspiring way in which we can address them. So, Rebecca, thank you very much for being available.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
So here we are in July 2020, which is, I think, marks 10 years since you started Plastic Free July. What made you, with all the environmental challenges we have, choose plastic as the thing to tackle?
So when I started, I chose plastic as something that I wanted to change in my own life because I was exposed to my own waste for the first time. And until that point, I thought I was doing pretty well. I was living pretty sustainably, but my journey into plastic started when I visited a recycling facility, and we talk about throwing our waste away, but I had never really thought about where it might go and what might happen to it. So when I visited the recycling facility for the first time, I saw the enormity of just how much waste I and the rest of the people in my community and my suburb were producing, and really understood the complex energy-intensive processes to sort that and turn it into new materials. And I really realised for the first time that, of course, recycling is important. It's best when we can to recycle packaging that we use if possible, but I really understood the challenges, and that the best thing that I could do was to actually reduce and refuse and rethink the things that I was buying and the things that we were accepting into our home to make a difference. And as we now all know, plastic is a particular challenge in terms of not just recycling, but when it ends up as litter in our environment and in our oceans.
So I heard, I think, a pretty staggering figure, and I think probably from you a few years ago in India, that we might have more plastic in our oceans than fish in the coming years.
Yeah, that's a really terrifying number, and I can't really wrap my mind around it. So the challenge with plastic is we're producing it in ever increasing amounts and volumes, yet at the same time our recycling has stayed pretty much the same since we first started mass production of plastic in the 1950s. So of all the plastic that we've ever made in this world, we've recycled 9%, and we've only recycled 0.9% more than once. So plastic is a wonderful material. It's really valuable. It's got so many important uses in our communications, in our healthcare systems, in our transport. But the problem is so much of it we're using for just a few minutes or seconds, the single-use disposable plastic packaging, and then we're throwing it away. And because it's so lightweight and so durable and so cheap, we're using a lot of it, and it's easy to end up as litter, and it is expensive and challenging to recycle, and it's easier to keep for manufacturers to keep producing more plastic and using new plastic rather than recycled content. And that's why we are, unfortunately, if we don't do something very differently, very quickly, we are on that trajectory to have an ocean that has more plastic than fish.
So you've made some really good points in just that short, sharp summary, one of which was health. So obviously since March this year, it's almost impossible to talk about anything other than COVID. Since the COVID crisis has come up, we've seen huge amounts of testing all over the world, which is appropriate, but it also means a huge amount of medical waste being developed. We've seen a lot of single-use masks, a lot of PPE equipment, which generally has either rubber or plastic as its main component, largely because of that, the ability to keep bacteria, viruses, or water or liquid out. So in the current environment, is it realistic to refuse or reuse plastic, and if so, how?
Okay, so I'm going to answer yes and no.
Okay, excellent.
So, look, obviously, right at this moment, human health is paramount, and we are listening to the science about how to prevent and how to manage the virus from the perspective of individuals. We also need to start listening to the scientists and the evidence about how the virus is transmitted more as well, and the actual risks rather than the perceived risks around plastic packaging. And so I think plastic has a role to play. I think having disposable plastic PPE and all of the other plastics that are used in our frontline fight against this virus and in our medical systems, it's important. And realistically, we're not, whereas we can at a personal level switch to cloth masks that are reusable and washable for personal use, we can't expect that in our medical system. So if we are using disposables, it's about collecting and disposing of that waste properly so it doesn't end up as litter. And so there has been a lot of talk about the increase in consumption of single-use plastics, and that's certainly the case in our medical systems and in, as we were discussing before, Tanya, with the shift from dine-in, in hospitality, in cafes, restaurants, etc., to the takeaway model. There has been the shift to disposables there. So, however, we need to remember, and this is what the scientists are telling us, and recently 125 scientists from around the world got together and signed a statement about the actual risks or lack thereof of using reusables. So this virus is a respiratory virus. It's not a gastrointestinal virus. So, and there's no evidence that you can get it through ingestion. So the things that we can do to prevent ourselves getting this virus or transmitting the virus to others if we unknowingly have it and we're in public spaces is the good hand hygiene. It's the physical distancing. It's the wearing of masks. And those are critical. And I think there's other concerns about it. It's almost a bit of a distraction. And one of the interviews that I've did for the book that I've written recently was with Professor Mary Louise McLaws, who's an infectious diseases expert and an epidemiologist at the University of New South Wales, and she is also a consultant to the World Health Organization's COVID response. And I asked her that very question about, is it safe to keep using reusable coffee cups to get takeaways? And she said those same things. And she also said, we need to be making sure we wash our cups or our reusable bags, keep our hands clean.
Sure.
Baristas shouldn't be touching the rim of the cup. We probably should just be holding back onto our lids, whether there is a pandemic or not. And then in Australia, the CSIRO and the US FDA, all their advice about, can you buy buying fresh fruit and vegetables, we don't need to buy them wrapped in plastic. Again, we just need to wash our hands before we prepare meals and just rinse in fresh water. There is no evidence we can get it through ingestion. And so buying this stuff in plastic packaging or not using our reusable shopping bags makes no sense. And the quote that I've written in the book from Professor McLaws is, she talked, and I won't paraphrase her, but she basically said human health and the health of our planet are not exclusive. We can and must do both at the same time. And I thought that was really important because I think that we're just, we've never had a better example at this time, but with climate change, we're realising how connected we are as communities with the health of our planet, and we can't have healthy communities in a polluted environment.
It's a really extraordinary point. And I know Al Gore, for example, who runs the Climate Reality Project, spoke about the fact that people are suffering from issue fatigue, that we have, climate change, we have issues with water security, we have issues with food security and the quality of our food, how chemically polluted that could be, and how it goes on to pollute our soil and things like that. And there's a sense of overwhelm of where to start. But he said one of the most assuring things, which you've pretty much touched on, is we might have all these issues, but the solution could be the same. So it's not that we have to do thousands of different things on thousands of different issues, but simply going to, say, organic food means that the soil gets richer with its natural nutrients, which means that it is a better absorber of greenhouse gas emissions. So it becomes a carbon sink rather than an emitter because it's so polluted and full. So we create these little cycles within our own ecosystem just through the same sustainable practices. Is that a type of message you're also trying to communicate, not just how to reduce plastic, but the fact that the effort in doing so could perhaps be consistent with solving a number of our global challenges?
Yeah, so that's so many interesting points you've raised there, Tanya. So with Plastic Free July, we don't talk about the problems. We're very driven by the problems and motivated by the problems. But as a campaign, we really focus on solutions, and it's very practical. So, but having said that, when we're sharing solutions, we're not just sharing, I'm running this global campaign from Perth, one of the most remote cities in the world. We share stories and solutions from people around the world who are participating. And we also share the benefits. And one of the greatest benefits that people report from doing Plastic Free July and trying to reduce the single-use plastics in their lives is that they feel healthier, happier, and more connected to their communities. Because like if you think about, where's a lot of the single-use plastics in our lives? It's in the food packaging. And a lot of that is food which has been, it tends to be heavily processed. It's got preservatives in, it's got palm oil in, or if you were talking about fresh produce, it's got a lot of food miles. And so by making the switch and trying to avoid single-use plastic, it starts to change our diet and our thought process about where we're buying our food from and what we're buying. So we're not buying food that's been packaged in plastic and transported halfway around the world with all of the footprint that entails. We're supporting like local farmers, going to farmers markets, going to greengrocers and independent stores, supporting local businesses and eating fresh local produce, which again has health benefits. And also we can then have the conversations. We know more the conditions of the people who are growing their food. Here in Australia at the moment, our farmers have been through drought, bushfires, hailstorms, and now COVID. I want my dollar to be going to my local farmers. And so you're right, it's so interconnected. And one of the challenges with this plastics issue, like so many of our environmental problems, is that it is affecting communities and people that have got the least resilience and the most to lose. So a lot of the places where plastic production is happening, the manufacturing and these petrochemical plants, because plastics are made from fossil fuels, they're in communities. They're not being built in wealthy suburbs. They're being built in poorer areas, and there's starting to be a lot of research on the health impacts of those communities. And when we look at where our waste ending up to be sorted and recycled. Again, it's often vulnerable communities. So everything is really interlinked, and I think the more that we can do at a personal level to reduce our footprint, plastic, carbon, water, all of those things environmentally, also supports healthy, sustainable and resilient communities as well. And I think they're so deeply intertwined.
No, I think that's right. And what I'm really struck by in everything that you're saying is that you're really emphasizing the local as well, the local impact in everything that you're doing and how that impacts community, which brings me to your model. So you started, I think, by saying that your primary motivation initially was being mindful of your own waste production with plastic. And then as you started to raise awareness within yourself, it was your family. And it started as a very small scale movement. But now you're, I think, published a book just very recently, which collects stories from all around the world. So I think this is an amazing example of how thinking small and local can certainly have an impact that has global reach. So could you please tell us a bit about your model and how that is expressed in the book you've just published?
So I call Plastic Free July an accidental campaign because I didn't set out to start a movement. It was really just about changing myself, and I'd had this idea and put the question, after visiting this facility, put the question to my 2 colleagues and our volunteers and said, I'm going to go plastic free next month. Who wants to join me? Had no idea where that journey would take me, how challenging it would be, but most importantly, how many other people said, yeah, I'll give that a try, I'll do that too, and how by making change with others, because I certainly didn't have all the ideas, but together we had lots of solutions. And so that first year was 40 people here in Perth, and it was really supportive, it was collaborative, we felt good about making a difference, about having less waste in our bins. And it grew from that. It became known as Plastic Free July just because July was the next month after I'd had this idea. And at that point, plastics was not the topic of conversation that it is now. But it was all about, well, what can I do? And people shared their successes of, finding alternatives, remembering their reusable bags and water bottles, buying, learning to make things from scratch. And then as people made changes in their own lives, they took it into their children's schools or their community groups or their workplaces or small businesses. And it's a great example of the power of grassroots change. And those 40 grew to 400 to 4,000. And last year, the estimates are 250 million people worldwide took part. But the model hasn't changed from the beginning. That hasn't happened with a big budget, but has happened with no advertising, not from us anyway. And it's really that it's been so focused on solutions, and our approach is about it's not about being perfect. It's not about getting a few people who can do everything and live plastic free. I'm certainly not plastic free. We probably reduced our waste in our house by 60 or 70%. But it's about getting lots of people to make small changes, because I think when you have lots of people making small changes at the same time, and you start to get a change across a community, across a state, across a country by 5%, that's when you change culture, and that's when you can influence business and government. And that is really the story of Plastic Free July. And whilst just one other thing I'd like to say about the model is whilst we're very focused on being driven by the problem, we don't talk about the problem, we talk about solutions. And we've done a lot of research now behind the campaign, and when we survey the general public, 8 out of 10 people say they're concerned about plastic waste ending up in landfill or the environment in the ocean. And when I first heard that, I said to the behavioural scientist that we work with, I said, Colin, you know, that can't be right, because 8 out of 10 people aren't refusing single-use plastic. And he explained to me this difference we can have between our attitudes and our values and our choices and our behaviour. So, and that was a real eye-opener to me, Tanya, because I think I came as an environmentalist and a scientist, I came from this attitude that if people aren't doing the right thing and being sustainable, it's because they don't understand. So we've got to give people more information. But what I've learned through this research and through this work and through seeing really practically the changes that and the impact of making changes in our own lives, not talking about it, but just taking action, is that it is so contagious. And I really switched my mindset about that. And I look at the climate change debate, and it is such a debate, and we're still prosecuting the argument rather than, and it's easy to think, well, if you don't agree with climate change, it's because you don't care about the environment. Like, no one wants to live in a polluted environment. No one wants to see these devastating impacts on our planet and our environment. So let's not talk about whether we agree on the science. Let's talk about our shared values, and let's talk about solutions.
That is a really inspiring and crucial point, because, I mean, even in the climate change debate, I think we get caught up with labels, and climate deniers versus, you know, this us and them language really comes out. So I really love the way you just say, well, no one wants to live in a polluted environment. And if we can get back to shared values, that's amazing. The one point I'd like to add, though, is about behaviour, and my awareness raised after you gave a talk in India several years ago. So I think sometimes we want to refuse plastic, but perhaps don't feel empowered to. So in the nature of my job, I tend to fly a lot, which I know has a carbon mile impact as well. But on flights, you get served a lot of single-use plastic. But after your talk, I just refused to accept it. So when I wanted a glass of water or a cup of tea, I just offered my bottle and said, could you please use this instead? I just don't want to use plastic. And at first they were a bit, resistant, but when I explained the reason, people were very accommodating. So I think sometimes you can have the values but fear the social impact, or fear that you're becoming a nuisance or a problem. And also I think it's about asking in a way that is positive and not judgmental, but just talking about the change you want to make rather than, perhaps a judgment or something like that. But you really empowered me to do that. So that is something I do now. India itself is getting very committed on plastic. It's quite sad, I think. You've highlighted all the benefits of plastic and its massive use from about the last 20 years or so, and I think more than 30 years or so. And I think that for many developing countries, they've unfortunately had the journey of going from very sustainable practices like India that used clay and leaves, leaves for plates, for example, or clay for chai pots, and they've moved to plastic, which was seen as, in a way, a sense of progress. And now they're kind of realising that they had it right to begin with and are trying to return to a more sustainable practice. Prime Minister Modi has publicly committed to 2022 as the year that India will go completely plastic-free, and many states have already moved in that path. So it's a fantastic journey with one of the largest countries in the world certainly following suit. I know there are lots of other issues like COVID and the economy, but hopefully, as we said, it's all related and that commitment will continue. I thought we could end by perhaps highlighting one of the stories from your book, which I think involves a story of a woman from India and her plastic-free July journey.
Yeah, so I really loved the trip that I made to India 3 years ago when I met you, Tanya, and I'm just feel incredibly privileged to have been able to go there. And whenever I travel, I always look up who's organising Plastic Free July and doing events, and get to meet people and make new friends. And so I met a woman in New Delhi called Vandana K. She's a journalist, producer, blogger, and was doing Plastic Free July and running some events in her community. And so we met a couple of times, and I did she organised a talk in a local cafe one day, and we just kept in touch. And in the book, which was published here in Australia and New Zealand, Plastic Free, the inspiring story of a global environmental movement and why it matters. When we looked at the plastic waste problem, it was really important to look at the issue from a really diverse range of perspectives. And so Vandana talked about the waste system in India and how exactly what you've just shared, Tanya, the story of how waste used to be managed versus how it is managed now. And so as Vandana was doing Plastic Free July, and she wasn't able to avoid all plastic, she said she had found a great water filter and she had that in her home, but when they had an issue of sewage coming through the drinking water tap, she had to get bottled water. So her solution was to, instead of buying lots of small bottles, the thing she could do was buy the biggest bottle she could, and they were refillable and at least get large containers of plastic. And one of the things that she did was one day asked her local collector, the person who came into her home and picked up her waste, if she could follow him for the day. So I'll just read for you. She said, "I have to talk about the waste workers. Vandana once spent a day following a local waste worker from her neighbourhood to witness the system firsthand. Once the garbage was collected and sorted, they gathered piles of plastic and cycled to an informal waste processing unit where they live. The waste workers gather plastic outside their homes and the buyers on-sell it to contractors where further material segregation takes place. It's sold, compacted into bales and sent to recycling factories on the outskirts of cities where it's converted into plastic pellets and then recycled. All the scavenged plastic can be sold. The PET bottles can earn waste collectors 15 to 30 rupees per day." So she talks in quite detail which materials have more value. But then she says, simply removing plastic from the economy isn't the answer unless there's a workable alternative in place. A huge number of waste workers are dependent on plastics to survive. These people are earning 200 to 300 rupees a day. The plastics issue cannot exist in isolation from the communities involved, the economic systems, and social and equity issues. In the context of India, the story has to include who collects your waste, what happens to them with new systems. And I thought that that was a really important story to tell, and it's not the same system, the same process happens here in Australia. Our recycling and our waste, it's a commodity market, but there's just more mechanisation in the process, and it just goes back to that previous point I've made where it is so cheap, and there needs to be, when we're using this material, we need to use it wisely and think about the second and the third use. And I just wanted to add one other thing, a lovely story about Vandana, which we describe later in the book. It was in 2018, World Environment Day by the UN was hosted by India, and the theme was Beat Plastic Pollution. And I felt really frustrated by all of the communications and all of the images that were coming out. It was all pictures of polluted beaches, and the focus was on cleanup. And I called up Vandana and said, you know, your country is hosting this. We're talking about beating plastic pollution. Can we do something to share the solutions? So she arranged, she's a great photographer, and so she went to some markets and stores and into people's homes of her friends and the community around her, took photographs of people using reusables, shopping at the market with their own bags, buying a drink without a straw, using a bamboo toothbrush. And we started sharing those on our social media for Plastic Free July, saying this is how you beat plastic pollution. And the sign-ups to Plastic Free July from India tripled, and she had people writing to her saying, oh, I understand it now. I used to think that living plastic-free or zero waste or being part of this movement meant you had to be a wealthy white woman from New York, but now I understand what to do. And that's just one of the beautiful stories in this book, Tanya, and I learned so much from visiting India that I think just made me really understand that we're all in this together, but there's not one size fits all solutions, and what we can all do is different, but we can all do something because we all deal with this material on a daily basis, and this is too important an issue not to do something about.
No, honestly, that's brilliant. And I love the way you've described that, because I think, again, it's simple psychology, but when you're just shown pollution and problems, you can't help but feel overwhelmed and depressed and almost paralyzed with a kind of fatigue. But when you can be empowered by simplicity, by just showing a simple choice that can be made. And to be honest, even in this call, it was inspiring to hear that you've reduced your household plastic to 60 or 70%. That's somehow more inspiring than if it was zero, because zero in my head almost feels unattainable, but reduction feels really possible, and that's something one can strive for. So honestly, your book sounds amazing. I'm really looking forward to reading it. And in a world where we seem to be beleaguered by problems all over in each country, it's just wonderful to think about inspiring, simple, local movements that can, through sustainable everyday practice in little ways, have a huge impact and hopefully a sustainable future for us all. So thank you very much, and really great to catch up with you again.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed our conversation, Tanya.